Hey, thanks, folks. Thanks for joining us today. I know you're pretty much excited as I am, even. So we covered Cisco ISE Troubleshooting Part 1 in the last month, Part 1 webinar. And this is going to be a continuation to that topic. Just to let you know, we have covered these many cases in our ISE Troubleshooting Part 1 in the last month. We covered most of the aspects are around a AAA when an unknown network device configured or a misconfiguration on the network device or radius attributes are invalid, allowed protocol, so on and so forth. We try to actually show you what are the errors or what are the error messages and what are the live logs, live sessions, and what are the tools available in ISE in order to troubleshoot such kind of cases. In continuation to that topic, now I'm going to be doing these cases. I'm going to be covering these cases in our today's topic. We're going to be doing IP device tracking. Does ISE support my network device? Understanding the logs and enabling the debugs on it and downloading it even. Debug Wizard, Guest Service on top of AAA, Posture Service on top of AAA. How do we capture the TCPDump and how do we create a support bundle and how do we leverage the session trace test and what exactly the purpose it is going to give us. Without much further delay, let's dive into our topic. Before even we dive into our topic, I wanted to actually quickly recap what we discussed in our earlier ISE Troubleshooting Part 1 webinar. You know, the administrator, when he is actually administering the total ISE cluster, be it for management purpose or be it for endpoints or policy administration purposes, he's going to be logging into the PAN. Whatever the configuration changes that was done on the PAN, that gets stored onto the PAN itself. And when the changes are going to be replicated to each and every node in your ISE cluster. Be it your MNT, PX grid, or SPAN, doesn't matter. The PPAN is going to automatically synchronize all the configuration changes that you have done on the PAN. With the configuration changes that you have done on the PAN, the PSN gets automatically the configuration changes, and it helps you to evaluate the policies so that the endpoints, when they come over wireless, wired, or a VPN network, the radius authentication the radius access requests are gonna be initiated on behalf of endpoints. That's gonna be evaluated by the PSN, and when it gets that radius request, as part of an authentication, the PSN is supposed to actually look into the external ID stores for the authentication purpose. If the authentication is successful, then the PSN can give granular access or differentiated privileges to the endpoint or users coming onto the network. Be it an employee getting a VLAN 100, be it a contractor getting an SGT20, or be it an IoT getting the ACL 300. That's all based on the policies that you defined on the PAN, which gets replicated to the PSN. Now, all those events are going to be actually captured by the MNT. It's going to be sent as a syslog to the MNT. Upon receiving the syslog from each and every node by the MNT, it's going to collect it and it's going to process it and it's going to actually write into its operational database so that you can view all those events happening straight away from the PAN. You don't have to even log into the MNT in order to view the live logs and live sessions or even actually dashboard all the utilities. So once after building that contextual information, the contextual information can be shared with the third-party ecosystem partners over PXGrid channel through the PXGrid node. Now, By getting that contextual information, the ecosystem partners can even leverage the ANC actions to give the restricted access. Now, as I said, when we were trying to actually troubleshooting an issue from the endpoint side or from the network device side, we need to actually focus on the policy evaluation part of it. Let's remove the contextual information. Let's forget about it just for the time being. Let's concentrate on the policy evaluation. As I said earlier, we need to actually touch base on each and every aspect that the endpoint actually going through. The problem might be there with the endpoints, the supplicants, or the problem might be there with your network devices, or the problem might be there with the external identity stores itself, or the problem might be there with your ISE itself. We will have to actually look into each and every touch points in order to understand what the problem exactly is. Now, having said that, I wanted to actually recap how the policy evaluation also happens. This was already covered in the earlier webinar. I just wanted to do a recap on it. So when the radius request comes down to the PSN by the network devices on behalf of the endpoints, you're going to be getting all the details, such as the username, what was the NAS IP address, what was the calling station ID, what was the call station ID, service type, port type, medium, so on and so forth. Once upon receiving that radius request, the PSN, the first thing it does is the NAD evaluation. It doesn't have to actually honor each and every radius that it was receiving. It was supposed to go through the NAD evaluation, whether it was getting it from the configured network device or not, or somebody was playing any man-in-middle attack or not. So for that reason, the NAD evaluation happens first. If at all there is any misconfigured network device, or if at all there is no network device configured at all, obviously the radius requests are going to be dropped by the PSN, so that it will not even go through the policy evaluation. If the NAD was configured properly, then the radius request is going to go through the policy evaluation. First thing and foremost thing is to match with the policy set that you have created. Based on the condition that you have created, the policy set is going to be matched with. It's a top to bottom approach. Once the policy set gets matched, underneath the authentication and the authorization policies are going to be evaluated. So if the authentication is successful, that's when only the authorization is going to be evaluated. If the authentication is failed, that's when automatically the radius access deny packet is going to be sent straight away to the network device, stating that the authentication itself is failed. So if the authentication is successful, as part of an authorization policy, if it is matching with a specific authorization rule, the associated authorization profile, which contains VLAN, DACL, ACL, URL redirected, so on and so forth, gets enforced onto the endpoint session. It might happen that you might even actually send the access deny packet in order to give the deny access to the specific endpoint or user that it was getting to. So we have covered all this in our earlier webinar. I highly encourage you to actually watch out for that session if at all you haven't done that so far. Now let's dive into our today's agenda. The first thing is case 15. As I said earlier, it's a continuation to the earlier part 1 topic. So I'm going to actually continue with the case numbers. So the case 15 that I'm talking about is IP device tracking. What exactly the IP device tracking is? IP device tracking is by default disabled on your network devices. It must be configured, and it helps the switches or your network devices to track the endpoints which are associated with the VLAN, static or dynamically IP address assignments, and it is the feature as part of SISF infrastructure. What exactly SISF infrastructure is? SISF infrastructure is nothing but a switch integrated security feature. As part of this switch integrated security feature, device tracking was also actually enabled with. What it does, it is the responsibility of the as part of a device tracking, if at all it is enabled, it helps the switches and your network devices to basically keep track of endpoints associated with the session, port numbers, ports, uh, the MAC address, IP address, in order to help these features such as TrustSec, DATE 2.1x MAP authentication, and a web authentications. If it was not configured properly, that means your 8.2.1x and web authentication, your TrustSec might not work properly. Please keep that in mind. So how do I configure it basically? So let me go ahead and actually go into my switch. This is my switch. I'm gonna log into it. Let me increase the font just for viewing purposes. Okay. So show device tracking. It is already enabled on my uh, switch. And if you look at it, it was keep tracking of the ARP entries listened from each and every endpoint connected to one of the switch ports. My environment is configured in such a way that all of my clients are configured associated to one or two switch ports. 1/0/14 or 1/0/13, it was associated with the port numbers, VLAN, the MAC address, and IP address. So basically, your network access device was keep tracking of all these devices. That is how you basically configure the IP device tracking. The next case which we are talking about is does ISE support my network access device? It is not actually part of my troubleshooting section, but I just want to actually, this is kind of a daunting question every day, every hour, or almost every day we're going to get this kind of questions. Does ISE support the network access device? Be it any third-party device like Aruba or whatever. The reason behind that is basically, of course, why not? The ISE supports any network access device which complies with the radius RFC standard. What are the radius RFC standard that ISE complies with? These are the radius RFC standards. You go ahead and look at what are the radius RFC standards that ISE supports with. It is not necessary that all the radius RFC standards are necessary for your feature to work. Most of the time, the third-party network devices are actually capable of doing a radius AAA. So obviously, the AAA is not going to be a problem. But when it comes down to the advanced services on top of AAA, like a posture, profiling, so on and so forth, then you might have to actually think about what is the RFC standard and protocols that the ISE supports. If you go to this page, community.cisco.com/docs64547, it's going to list down the validated network access devices. So Cisco ISE engineering is going to validate the couple of third-party network devices. Thus, please do keep in mind, if at all you haven't find your network device over there, it doesn't mean that the network device is not supported. It is just that it was not validated by the ISE engineering team. Imagine or keep yourself into the engineering shoes. We have so many versions of ISE, so many network devices out there with the different vendors, different versions. If you do a permutation combination with the features, ISE versions, network devices, and network device versions also, it's going to be a massive task in order to actually support each and every network device with the different versions associated and the different features associated with it. That was the reason why we were trying to keep it very simple. As long as the ISE, as long as the radius RFC was supported by the network device, it does support ISE, it does support your network device. So the next case that we were talking about is understanding logs. Most often, you're going to be asked a question when you are encountering a problem. I wanted to actually I wanted to understand where exactly the problem is by looking at the live log. Sometimes the live log might not be able to actually give you the exact reason. There might be an exceptions or errors, or it might be a warning or the failures, or even the API failures that you might be able to get it in the logs itself. For that purpose, what you're supposed to do, you're supposed to actually you can go into the ISE operations debug wizard, debug log configuration, select the node. And let's say I wanted to actually address the Active Directory issues that I'm encountering with. So I'm going to actually turn the debug for that Active Directory component. I'm going to go back to recreate the issue. I'm going to go to that specific node and download that log so that when it gets downloaded, it's a zip file. You can unzip it and you can actually open the log file and you can actually see where exactly the problem is, whether there is any communication error, whether there is any timeout or exception, or whether there is any problem. So you can actually go deep into the live log. Now, if you look at the components available, there are so many components available and the log file associated with it. If at all you're trying to configure, if at all you're trying to actually troubleshoot an Active Directory, it's going to be written into the AD_agent log. If at all you're trying to troubleshoot a CA service, it's going to be there in the CA service.log. Then it brings up the question, how do I remember all these components? How do I remember all these log file names? Don't worry about it. The debug wizard is going to be helpful for you. What exactly the debug wizard is? Basically, I'm going to actually go back to my ISE screen. So if I go to the operation troubleshooting debug wizard, the debug wizard helps you to troubleshoot a specific feature or a specific service that you are encountering a problem with. Let's imagine the situation you are getting authentication failures over a .1x or a map authentication itself. Then I can actually rely on this component itself, the debug feature, the profile itself. Active Directory, if at all I'm facing an issues with an Active Directory, I can actually go ahead with an Active Directory one. Basically, how do I enable debugging on this? Let's say I wanted to troubleshoot the guest issues in my environment. I'm going to be selecting the guest portal, select the debug nodes. You're supposed to actually select the PSN on which you're getting the authentication failures, redirection issues, or the guest access issues. So I do have only one ISE in my deployment at this point of time, so I'm going to select that and PSN itself or ISE itself, and I'm going to save that configuration. That way, you're basically asking ISE, hey, ISE node3.dominion.m, you are basically allowed to go and debug the guest portal. What exactly it does, if you look at the guest portal, these are the component and log level. If you look at it, it automatically enables debug for the guest admin component, guest access component, and guest access admin component. It also enables the debug on the runtime AAA, SAML, so on and so forth. So you don't have to worry about remembering all the component and the log file names. So once you recreate the issue, you can basically download the respective log, or you can even download the support bundle associated with it. Once after recreating the issue, you might have to turn off the debugging. So I can select back the guest portal, uncheck the nodes on which I have enabled the debug on, save the configuration so that it automatically puts them back to the initial state. I don't want you to overwhelm with so many debug logs on your ISE environment if you don't disable it automatically. It doesn't get automatically gets disabled. You will have to manually disable it. So once after recreating the issue, you might have to turn off the debugging on that PSN. That's basically the debug profile configuration helps you with. Now, the next thing is actually Cisco ISE Guest Troubleshooting. There are a hell lot of actually guest access issues that you might be getting encountered with, but I'm not gonna be touch base on each and every guest access issue that you're getting it. But most of the time, when a new person trying to actually do a guest access with an ISE, what are the most common pitfalls that they're gonna encounter with? I know you're pretty much familiar with this issue. The redirection doesn't happen. When such thing happens, basically, you might have to actually clean through the ACL or a DACL enforced onto the session, or you might have to watch out what are the ports that were allowed as part of this ACL or a DACL. You might have to actually look into the URL redirect enforced onto the session. You might have to even see whether the proxy is being used in your endpoint itself, which was preventing to access the URL redirect. So for that, I'm going to be taking two examples. One example is where my endpoint is a wireless endpoint, and I'm trying to connect it to the wireless SSID. And I'm trying to actually enforce some URL redirect and some URL redirect ACL from an ISE. And let's see what happens if at all there is a problem with the ACL that I've configured. Now, this is my endpoint. This is a Mac operating system. And I was trying to actually associate this Mac to employee-map SSID. That's Open SSID. I tried it several times, but it was continuously failing. It's not getting associated even. But when I come back to the ISE says the guest authentication itself is passed. I mean, the map authentication itself is passed. If you look at the details, it was enforcing URL redirect ACL called initial1, a tag, and URL redirect. Let's see whether this ACL was even configured on your WLC or not. So I'm making use of a 9800 WLC. I'm going to go to the ACL and I'm going to glean through the ACLs that are configured. I didn't find the initial one as part of my ACL config. That was the reason why no endpoints are being associated with these SSID. Having said that, obviously, what is the next thing that I need to resolve this? I need to create that ACL. So let's go ahead and create the ACL. Be very much cautious about the ACL. It's a case sensitive. It is supposed to be exactly same as you configured in your ISE. So now that I've configured it, and let's try to associate the endpoint to that SSID. Now that it got associated. So that's how basically you need to see whether there is any mismatch in the ACL that you have configured on ISE. The same ACL was even configured on your wireless controller or not. If at all there is a mismatch, or if at all it is not even configured, you might have to actually go ahead and configure it. Now, the next scenario that I'm going to be giving you, okay, now the ACL was configured. Despite configuring that ACL on the WLC or on the switch port, what happens if the ACL was not configured with the proper ports and protocols associated or required for me to get redirected to? I'm going to be taking one live example over here. So I'm going to be going ahead. Going to be connecting to my switch port again. I'm going to be taking a wide client connected to one of the switch port as an example here. I'm going to be increasing the font for your visibility purpose. Let's see, first of all, the sessions associated with the interface. Like I said earlier, most of my endpoints are connected to one of the switch port called 1/0/14. And this is what the endpoint MAC address that I'm trying to connect with. Let's see what's there. Show authentication session MAC details. It says the .1x, it looked into the .1x initially. Let's look at the switch port configuration even. The switch port configuration was configured in such a way that it was enabled with the .1x. It was also enabled the order. First it goes with the .1x and then after it falls back to the map authentication. So it was enabled with the .1x, it was enabled with the map authentication. The order and priority was given to the .1x. And once the .1x is timed out, that's when only it's going to go into the map authentication. So it falls back to the map authentication. That's why if you look at this detail, the guest endpoint tried with the .1x initially, but later point of time it timed out and it got it fall back to the map authentication, and the map authentication was succeeded. Now it got authorized, and this is the ACL that was enforced onto the switch port, switch session, and this is the URL redirect, and the SGT0, that means unknown SGT tag, was associated to the session. Now let's go to the endpoint, and this is my endpoint. And if you look at the endpoint here, the endpoint was the browser automatically detected that there is a redirect. You are supposed to actually log into the portal. So it detected that there is a URL redirect. When I clicked on it, it was not even actually fine. So the URL redirect is not happening. Let's troubleshoot from the endpoint side. I got my IP. Of course, the IP address was available. I was trying to actually resolve ISE Node 3.dominion.in, that's my ISE. If I try to look for ISE Node 3.dominion.in, the DNS request itself is getting failed. Oh, so the DNS resolution itself is not happening. So let's look at what exactly problem on the ACL side. So let's see, show IP access list, initial 1. And if you look at it, the way it works is, as I said earlier, this is the URL redirect ACL. And this ACL works in a fashion, whatever the ACL access control entries that you have denied with, that means they are not supposed to honor the URL redirects. That means you are allowing the DHCP request, you are allowing the ping traffic, but you're not allowing, or whenever the endpoint is trying to access 80 or 443 URLs, that means it is supposed to actually honor the URL redirect. That's what it means. So you are allowing the DHCP, you are allowing the ICMP packet, but you're not allowing the DNS. So obviously that's the problem. Let's go ahead, configure that. I'm gonna remove the last two entries, 60 and 70 entries. I'm gonna allow my DNS, and then I'm gonna actually put back the earlier AC entries, 443 and 80. Now let's go back to the endpoint and see what happens. Now let's try to resolve the PSN now that it was resolved. It's querying my DNS server and it was able to get back the response from the DNS server. Let's try to ping this guy. It's reachable, okay? Now that it is reachable, let me try to click the open network login page and see what happens. Now it's trying to actually go for a redirect, but still it's not getting redirected. Let's wait for a couple of seconds whether it is going to be able to reach the PSN or not. Basically, it was supposed to be redirected to the guest portal. Because it is a HTTP request, it's going to wait for 120 seconds. Then after, it's going to automatically time out if at all it is not reachable. I want that guy to fail, the HTTP request to fail. Let's wait for a couple of more seconds. Now, if you look at it, this is the URL that it was trying to actually go to. But if you look at it, it was trying, of course, ISE Node 3.dominion.in, it's reachable from the ACLs. But if you look at the 8443, that port is not allowed in your ACLs. What does it mean? You're supposed to actually do show IP access list. You're supposed to allow that port number too. So let me then remove that 70 and 80 entries, and I'm going to add deny TCP any equivalent to 8443. Let's put back the TCP request so that if the endpoint is trying to go for a Google or Yahoo or any server, it's going to automatically get redirected to the guest page. That's my expectation. Now that we have configured this, let's see the ACL again. So you are allowing DHCP, you are allowing ping, you are allowing the DNS, you are allowing 8443, but you are not actually 443 and 480 ports. That means when the endpoint is actually accessing any URL on 80 or 443 port, it was supposed to honor the URL redirect. That's what it means. So now let's see from the endpoint side. Now I can click on the try again button. It's okay. I can go back to the open network login page so that it gets redirected to the guest portal. Boom. So that's how I will be able to actually access my guest portal. I can log into the guest portal using the guest credentials that I created earlier. Now that it was got authenticated and now the guest authentication was successful, let's look at the show authentication session details of the endpoint. Now it got authenticated and the SGT value 6 was enforced on it. It's a session timeout. I think it is a contractor. That was the reason why we have a huge session timeout value enforced on this session guy. So that's how basically you're going to actually look into the URL redirects if at all it is not working. Now of course, these are the most common pitfalls that you're going to be encountering in your day-to-day or when you are actually configuring ISE for the first time. That was the reason why I was trying to actually get these 2 or 3 use cases where exactly the problem is, try to find out the problem and then by how to resolve it. Now let's try the same thing on the posture service. On top of AAA, what happens if there is a problem with the posture? So the common thing is most often you're gonna be getting issues. Hey, my AnyConnect agent doesn't even discover the PSN. It gives me the unknown access all the way. It doesn't even give me the compliant access at all. It is not even getting redirected. It is not even actually contacting my PSN. Those are the common issues that you might be getting during your posture scenario. Of course, there are advanced scenarios which are possible, but I wanted to help you with this redirection and discovery happens. So let me go ahead in the ISE live log and show you the live log around the posture. If I go ahead, there is a posture guy called Dominion/AD posture, which is actually going through the posture service, and the posture unknown access was enforced onto this guy. And let's do a terminate and let's see what happens. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to that endpoint, posture endpoint. This is my Windows 11. I'm going to log into it. I'm going to be looking for the IP address. Of course, the IP address, I got it. And I'm going to look into the NAC, the ISE also, I mean the AnyConnect. And the AnyConnect was already downloaded and installed. But right now, even though it got authenticated successfully against the PSN, it was not even able to detect the policy server. And what is exactly the problem is? So let's see it from the ISE switch itself. Show authenticated session interface gig 1/14. That's where my endpoint got connected. This is the endpoint MAC address. So let's find out what are the ACL URL redirect or SGTs that were enforced onto this switch session or the .1x session. If you look at it, the ACL that was enforced onto it is posture unknown. It's basically getting redirected to a URL and an SGT of an unknown value got associated to it. The .1x authentication was successful on this endpoint. Now, despite having this posture unknown ACL and URL redirect, the AnyConnect was not able to actually contact the ISE Node 3. Now, I want you to focus on the FQDN. I want you to focus on the port number. Let's look at the ACL too. Show IP access list, posture unknown. And if you look at it, you're trying to allow, like we were having the ACL called initial one, we were also allowing your DNS, DHCPs, ping packets, TCP on the DNS server. 8443 also you are allowing, but you are not allowing 8445 packet. Where exactly this port number came from? So let's go into the ISE and see what exactly the issue is. It's getting redirected to the client provisioning portal. So you need to go to the posture service, work center posture, client provisioning portal, go to the client provisioning portal. By default, the portal is going to be configured with the 8443 itself. But I purposefully actually modified it to 8445. And the bidirectional port is actually 8449. So it is not only the 8443 it requires at this point of time, it is required for it to access the 8445, 8449 too. So let's add these port numbers in your ACL so that whether endpoint could try to reach the client provisioning portal or not. So I'm going to go into my access list again. I'm going to remove the last entries. I'm going to say, hey, whenever any traffic comes from equivalent to 8443, don't honor any URL redirects, just redirect them to that 8443 port. The client provisioning portal was configured with 8445, so I'm going to be allowing that. And bidirectional port, which helps the any connected to keep track of the posture status that's listening on 8449, I wanted to allow it even. So 8445, 8449, 8443 is a default port for all the portals until and unless you modify it. So I'm keeping that as well. So rest everything, if at all the client was trying to access any URL, it is supposed to be redirected on 80 or 443. So now let's go to the endpoint. Now try to see whether it can redirect to the client provisioning portal. Now that it was allowed the 8445 port, it was basically able to redirect it. Now on the ISE side, I can click on the scan again button. Let's see whether AnyConnect was able to contact the PSN. There is an internal error. I'm going to try it again. Oh, now this time it got two requirements. And if I go ahead in the posture scan, it was basically, it was trying to contact the ISE Node 3. And these are the security products installed on my endpoint. And these are the checks that it performed. And it got now compliant access. So that's how basically you need to first of all address the ACL issues, URL redirect issues. It is not necessary for you to configure URL redirect. URL redirect can be avoided even. You can let the any connector to contact the PSN specified in the call home list even. So that call home list is going to be there in your posture configuration file. So where I'm trying to push it from the ISE itself, or you can even push it from your SCCM servers or group policies, etc., so on and so forth. So I was purposefully configured this guy, AnyConnect, to contact ISE Node 3 Dominion.in even if there is no URL redirect. So that's how I basically configured my call home list to contact that it automatically. It doesn't have to go with a URL redirect. Now that's how basically you need to troubleshoot the basic discovery and the redirection. But I know you might be looking for more advanced posture issues such as tail session, phantom session, discovery issues other than these redirects, re-authenticating on different PSN, how the posture state is going to be shared amongst the different PSNs which are in the cluster. All it might happen that the endpoint can get authenticated against a PSN1. It can query the PSN1. It gets the posture policies evaluated and gets into the compliant access. Now the PSN1 is the owner for that endpoint session. Imagine the situation during the course of time if the endpoint got re-authenticated against a PSN2. Now the PSN2 was supposed to be the owner, but the posture state is not going to be transferred to it. And then what happens? All those were already articulated in this URL. I highly encourage you to go through it. Let me just go to it. So if you go to this as cs.co/ISE-troubleshooting, it will take you to the ISE troubleshooting tech notes. It has a lot of troubleshooting tech tools available. I'm going to glean through the posture, session management and posture. So all those scenarios, advanced scenarios where the posture is used that you're going to encounter with, they were articulated over here. So I highly encourage you to actually go through it. Then the next case comes down to the TCPDump. In an event where the endpoint is not getting authenticated successfully, or when there is a problem with a specific services, we might have to actually capture the packets from the ISE node itself. The TCPDump utility is a very, very a common utility where most of the network and security engineers are going to be looking for. The TCPDump utility, which was available earlier in earlier versions, was enhanced a lot. Now it can basically run on multiple nodes at the same time. The filters means whatever filters which are compatible with the TCPDump utility on a Linux operating system, the same filter options can be supported by this TCPDump utility from the ISE UI itself. Once after capturing your PCAP file, you can even download that PCAP file, or you can even actually post it into the repository. You don't have to worry about actually automatically terminating the TCPDump. You can configure the time limit at what length the TCPDump has to capture the packets. You can even set the time limit, and so that it automatically stops after the configurable time limit. The way it works is, let's go ahead and do the live demonstration. Let me go to the operations troubleshooting, the diagnostic tools this time. Go to the TCPDump. I do have already ISE node. Let's look at the parameters that it was already having. I do have only one ISE node. In case if you have multiple ISE nodes, the dropdown is going to actually list on all those ISE nodes. You have to select with what PSN or what node that you are encountering a problem with, and you are supposed to actually select the interface from which the service is operating. You can apply the filter, run it. It automatically runs it. Now the status was changed to the running. You can select and stop at any point of time. Now that it was stopped, the status was moved to the completed state. I can even actually download this TCPDump PCAP file onto my local, or even you can actually specify the repository. I wanted to actually specify the filters. Let's say I'm having a problem with an endpoint having an IP address 192.168.105.249. I'm going to be specifying that IP address, and I'm going to be saving and running it at the same time. So it's been running, and it automatically captures the packets that are being originated and that have been actually coming through this specific host. And once after I've done the recreate the issue, I can actually stop the packet trace. I can download the packets. I can even enhance the filter options. Let's say it's having a problem with a URL redirect or a specific portal which is listening on 8443. Then I can actually specify that filter option called 8443. And I can actually save and run it. Like this, you can even enhance your TCP dump with so much filter options. One of the questions that I received was, how do I capture the MAC addresses in the filter options? So I can actually specify even the MAC address of an endpoint that I'm getting an issue with. So the filter is supposed to be with ether host. Let me just try to grab one of the endpoint MAC address. Let's grab it from the ISE live log itself. Recently, we have done the posture of an endpoint, right? Let's grab that endpoint MAC address itself. So I'm going to grab this MAC address, which is going through the posture, and paste it as a filter option. And I'm going to save and run it. Now that it is running, is it going to be capturing the packets coming from this host? It might not. It is basically depends on your network topology. The way in an enterprise network operates is the endpoints are going to be in your access layer, but your ISEs might be there in the DMZ zones. So it might be passing over several hops in order to reach the ISE. So during the transition, obviously, during the transmission of this packet, obviously, the MAC address is not going to be visible or available to the ISE itself. So I would not encourage you to capture the endpoint MAC address until and unless they are in the same subnet. If at all they are not in the same subnet, it will not even actually capture any packet. Let's try it out. Let me stop the packet trace and let's see whether it is still in the completed state. Okay, let me stop this packet. It's completed. Now let me just download the packet. It got downloaded. I'm trying to actually open it. And if you look at it, there is no packets from that endpoint itself. The reason behind that is my endpoint and the ISE are there in different subnets, and it's basically my network topology is such a way that it's basically reaching the ISE after several hops. So obviously the MAC address is not going to be available to the ISE. So I would not encourage you to use the MAC address based filtering whenever you're doing a PCAP file of an endpoint. I would encourage you to use some other options such as port numbers or the IP addresses that it was getting with. Now that's about the TCP dump. Let's go ahead and look at the next thing, the support bundle. How do I create a support bundle? There is a process actually associated with the support bundle creation, and let me help you with that process. Whenever somebody asks you to create a support bundle, that means you are already you are already facing some issue. Most often the tag people might ask you to recreate the issue, enable the debug logs, recreate the issue, disable the debug, and to create the support bundle. So the process is you're supposed to enable the debug on the services that you are getting the authentication or service failures. Once after you enable the debug, you are supposed to recreate the issue so that we will be able to capture that in the log files. Once it is captured and recreated the issue, you have to actually stop the debugging on the PSN nodes or the ISE nodes. Then after you need to actually export the support bundle or collect the support bundle. Let's do with live demonstration. When somebody asks you to actually create a support bundle, I'm going to go to the download logs, select that specific node. And the support bundle includes, this was some modified a lot in back in 2.x version itself. Earlier, we used to actually dump everything into the support bundle. Now, you don't have to actually dump everything into the support bundle. When we wanted to when we recreated the issue, you might have to actually enable the debug. So the debug logs are supposed to be included in your support bundle. You're supposed to probably, based on the scenario, you might have to actually include the local logs. If at all it is happening because of a memory issue, RAM ran out of issue, or a garbage collection issues, the core files might have been generated on the ISE. Then in such cases, you might have to include the core files too. So whatever relevant log files, you might have to select them, select the date so that start date and end date, so that the support bundle is not overwhelmed with the files. Then after, you can actually provide encryption key and start creating the support bundle. It's going to take this support bundle. Once after creation, it automatically gives you an option to download it. You can download it and you can even attach it to the stack case that you have generated. That's how basically you can create a support bundle. Now, the last thing that I wanted to touch base on is a session trace test. The session trace test, let me help you with that straight away. If I go to the diagnostic tools, the session trace test, by default, you might not be having any test cases. It's basically a test case. Why is it a test case? Imagine the situation. I have these policies. I have created the policy sets. I've created the policies, and I wanted to test it out in my test environment before even going into the live environment, the live production environment. When I created the policies around the ISE, I wanted to actually test it out with a handful of devices. In case, if at all, you're not able to have all the devices handy, then the session trace test is going to be helpful for you. You can go to the diagnostic tools, troubleshoot diagnostic tools, session trace, and I can create a test case such as, hey, what happens if a user called AD posture coming over .1x authentication method with this MAC address, what happens? I can run this against my ISE PSN. I can select the PSN with which I wanted to run against with, and it automatically runs that policy evaluation on that node using the parameters that you have passed on. It automatically says, hey, it matched with the posture policy set. It matched with the default network access protocols list. It matched with all user ID store sequence. It matched with authorization policy called posture unknown policy, and it matched with the posture unknown access profile. You can also actually get what are the groups associated for this and user, what are the attributes associated with this user. Based on this, you can even actually say, let's say this group, I wanted to modify the same test case with the custom attribute, one more attribute. What happens if the same user coming from the Active Directory, is that Active Directory? This is my Active Directory domain, external groups. And I'm looking for this guy, basically. Is that AD posture? Let me filter out the posture. I think it's not working. So I have to actually select it manually. Think there is this one. I'm going to add that attribute, save it, run the test again. Now this time, whether the policy evaluation changes or not, let's see, the policy is not changed. So you can add more attributes as if you were actually trying to authenticate from that user. So this way it will help you which policy it's going to match with. You can create the conditions like you are creating in the policies, the same way you are trying to create the conditions and you're trying to simulate it. That's how basically the session trace test is going to be useful for you. Now, having said all this, we come down to our last thing. This was the poll question that we asked in our last webinar. What additional utilities do you want to have in Cisco ISE for better troubleshooting? You gave a lot of answers. I'm very thankful for you. This was helping us to basically address most of your concerns. So if you look at it, some of you are looking for simulated clients, AI, PCAP, packet tracers, so on and so forth. Let me try to actually highlight some of it. You're trying to actually look for debug authentication. Yes, we did that. You're looking for quick access to debug. You're looking for a dashboard, PCAP, testing tools, packet tracer, packet capture, including MAC addresses, support bundle for endpoints. Yes, we already covered as part of our part 1 and part 2 webinar. Coming down to the other things such as simulators, simulator client, simulator for policy, I guess you are very much excited and you are very much impressed with the simulator that I was making use of it in part 1 webinar. So if at all you're looking for such kind of a simulator, I highly encourage you to wait for the next upcoming webinar that's going to happen on May 4th called Radius Simulation with ISE. My colleague Thomas is going to help you with the Radius simulation. So I highly encourage you to go and register for that webinar so that you can actually get more insights. How do you make use of a simulator from the for the ISE policies evaluation? Having said all this, I want you to actually get away with the resources. The new vanity URL that I've created, the shortcut, Cisco ISE-troubleshooting, cs.co/ISE troubleshooting. This is where most of the troubleshooting tech notes were captured with. I highly encourage you to actually go through it. And with that said, any outstanding questions, Rico, for me to answer?
Yeah, thank you so much, Pavan. So in looking at our Q&A panel here, I do see we have 2 outstanding questions. First one is, why is the IP device tracking important in ISE? If it's not enabled in our switches, are we losing some visibility under ISE on users connected to that switch?
So basically, like I said earlier, the network device helps you to track the endpoints associated with the what port number, what was the session ID, what was the MAC address, what was the IP address that it was having, IPv6 address or IPv4 address. It was keep track of all this information, the IP device tracking. The same information is going to be passed on to the ISE2. It helps greatly in redirecting the user to so and so pages. It helps greatly in the map and the .1x authentication and the trust sector implementations. If you don't have that enabled, Obviously, the IP address, the authentication status might not be in a starting state. You might have got the radius access request and you might have got the access accept packet, but the radius accounting start packet is not having that visibility into the endpoint the switches were associated with. So obviously we need that tracking mechanism. Hey, this is the IP address of that endpoint, MAC address and IPv6 of that endpoint. And obviously we were gonna get not only the visibility, it helps greatly the switch to implement the security features when it is trying to sniff or glean through the IP addresses that was already available in the network. So it is part of SISF infrastructure and it is must to configure in your environment.
Perfect. Thank you so much for addressing that, Pavan. And last question here before we wrap up. Does access list for ISE work in reverse? For instance, permit statement for deny action and deny statement for permit action.
That's a very good question. Most often, this is the daunting question when I was working with ISE in my earlier days. So when you apply ACL, what is exactly the ACL? Why are we trying to enforce an ACL? The ACL can be enforced onto the endpoint session. What kind of a privileges it is supposed to get the access? That's why the ACL are going to be enforced onto the session. Now, when you enforce without URL redirect ACL, an ACL is enforced onto the switch port session or a WLC session or a VPN session. Permit is going to be permit. Deny is going to be deny. But when it comes to the same ACL being referred as a URL redirect ACL, in that ACL, if at all you called out a deny specific port or deny specific traffic, that means we were asking the switch, hey, do not honor the specific traffic coming from the endpoint. Do not apply the URL redirect onto that traffic. That means you are basically allowing it. Deny means you are basically allowing it. It's opposite. That's the reason why whenever you have a URL redirect ACL, in that URL redirect ACL, you are supposed to actually write it in the reverse fashion.